Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now. I'm John Molesky. Wilson Center Now is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And our guest today is Sherri Goodman. Sherri is a senior fellow with 3 of the Wilson Center's program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, and the Polar Initiative. Sherri's also a former U.S. Deputy Undersecretary for Defense, where she dealt with environmental security issues. She joins us today to discuss climate change, talk about environmental security issues. That's the big gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla. Sherri, I don't want to be too clever here, but I want to share a quote with you that I discovered in anticipation of our discussion and see if you have any association with this. This is a major global leader speaking at the UN, and the quote is, "It is life itself that we must battle to preserve. The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so we may not live at the expense of future generations. That prospect is a new factor in human affairs. It's comparable in its implications to the discovery of how to split the atom. Indeed, its results could be even more far-reaching." Quite a statement. Here's the kicker. Margaret Thatcher said that in 1989, 30 years ago. And then where are we in 2019? We don't seem to have taken that warning to heart.
Not as much as we should have, John. That's absolutely true. Although I think we may finally be hitting close to a tipping point in the climate debate, at least in the United States. I think now the rest of the world recognizes that climate change is the greatest global challenge we face today.
But without a major polluter like us involved, their efforts are not what they could be.
That's correct. I mean, there's still much more we need to do to mobilize both in our own country and globally to combat the climate challenge. We can do it. We must do it, for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. It is the greatest global challenge we face of our time. And that's why, as you know, I've been working on this for almost as long as Margaret Thatcher.
It's not your fault.
Yes.
But talk more about this tipping point. I want to hear the optimism, because there's a certain Groundhog Day aspect to this discussion where the world seems to take steps forwards. I remember all the euphoria at the time of the initial Paris Agreement. And then we take steps backwards, as we've done under the Trump administration. Why are you optimistic about this tipping point?
Well, the old adage of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah.
So if Paris was 2 steps forward, okay, of course, in the United States, we've taken a step back with the president's proposed withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and from other steps even very recently within this administration. On the other hand, you see the groundswell in the new Congress for very ambitious goals on climate action. You see lots of climate action occurring at state and local levels among business leaders and the business community now, and even within our own national security community.
And public opinion polling, we've passed that tipping point. The majority of Americans accept this as a problem that needs to be addressed.
Exactly. It's not just a problem, but it's a challenge where we have, and we know what the solutions are. It's just that we have to mobilize across a variety of sectors.
That's the frustrating part, isn't it? Knowing what needs to be done, but then finding the political will to do it.
Yes, that is in part the frustrating challenge, but it is also the great opportunity of our time.
Such an optimist, I
know. We didn't know when we put in place the Marshall Plan that it would enable us to really create the most prosperous economies in the West across Europe and Japan after World War II. We had no idea it could be so successful, and yet we've created the most prosperous societies along with our own and our deepest allies and partners, who we need very much now in this modern era to combat the current challenges we face from climate change, from other global actors. So we know that technology also has enabled us to transform our societies. The climate solutions are in resilience building and energy transformation.
And climate deniers, or those at least who were not completely on board for climate action, one of their arguments had been that it would cost jobs, it would hurt the economy. But we're seeing the exact opposite, aren't we?
Quite the opposite. In fact, that we know that we're growing our economy even as we're moving to lower carbon sources of energy and more resilient futures. You know, the natural gas boom in the last decade is one case in point. It's not a carbon-free solution, but it's a lower carbon solution than coal and oil, and it's made the U.S. an energy superpower. The next wave is in renewables, wind and solar, that are coming on very strong and increasing share of their markets, increasing growth opportunities in states all across the country.
What is the timeline? I know that's almost impossible to answer, but your sense of it, if Margaret Thatcher was expressing urgency in 1989, and here we are 3 decades later, and we are now living it, we're not talking about climate change impacts as theory. Even as we sit here, the UK is experiencing its warmest winter in forever and is dealing with wildfires. It's no longer what might happen, things are happening. So where are we as far as how much time we have and what type of action needs to happen, how quickly?
Well, we're living now in a new normal of extreme weather events. You know, we now have extreme storms battering our coastlines on a regular basis, and wildfires and floods, with the cost of the disasters mounting each year, the highest cost every successive year now in the United States, approaching $100 billion.
It's a record every time.
Right. So if we took that money and we began to invest it instead of in paying for the damages after they occur, but invest it in today, now in both making our communities more resilient where they are and in transforming our energy systems by a combination of reducing the subsidies that we still give to carbon-producing industries, and then providing incentives through R&D and other forms to and putting some price on carbon. At some point, we'll be able to come up with those solution sets.
In the introduction, I mentioned your DoD background and your Pentagon experience. One of the things I've learned since coming to the Wilson Center, and it's been fascinating to see, is that the military is way ahead of the curve, and not just the U.S. military, globally. Militaries are way ahead of the curve on this issue in ways that the political sphere hasn't kept up. And talk about that. Is it because in many ways the military becomes the first responder when these global catastrophes strike? There hasn't been a room for climate deniers, because when you're in the front lines, you've got to deal with reality.
Exactly. You've got it just right, John. You know, the military is often the 911 force responding to natural disasters, and we have to train like we fight with hotter and hotter temperatures. It's more and more difficult. Our military knows that climate change is a threat multiplier for instability around the world, and also affecting our forces. We increasingly have to deploy our forces at home today to fight natural disasters.
Explain that threat multiplier concept. I know you use it all the time, and so I know what it means, but I'm just going to not assume that all of our viewers and listeners do. So explain what you mean by that.
Well, climate change now acts to accelerate and multiply any threats that we face, either from terrorism, other sources of instability. We see it in geostrategic conflicts around the world. We have a whole new region of the planet, the Arctic, that has opened up because of climate change, where we now face potential competition with Russia and China and others who are in a quest to obtain the resources of that and riches of that region.
So you may have a challenge already, ladle on top of that flooding or famine or drought or wildfires, and suddenly you've got a bigger problem.
Exactly. The problem becomes that much more difficult to manage. We're forced into greater areas of instability. We're forced into having to deploy more forces more frequently to combat terrorist, extremist, other sources of instability that are taking advantage of vulnerable populations around the world because food and water are becoming increasingly scarce, or water in areas where it's already water-stressed areas. Water can be weaponized and withheld from vulnerable populations.
Sherri, we mentioned the Paris Agreement a few times. What is its status now, and is there still an opportunity for the U.S. to change course?
Well, the president has said he plans to withdraw. That won't be effective now until next year. If he continues on that path, he would have a chance, some suppose, to change his mind. Not that he said he will. So he's made that announcement. On the other hand, there are many who hope he will change his mind. The states and localities are still continuing to push forward.
Emmanuel Macron at one point had talked about he's going to make it a mission to try to convince Trump to change his mind on this.
Yes, and I think there are many global leaders who hope that he will, and nonetheless, action continues to move forward.
Can it still be effective without the U.S.?
Not nearly as effective, because we are such a major part of both global emissions. Although China is also a major component, but at the same time, we need our commitment in terms of the energy transformation.
Speaking of the lead role that military has taken, tell us about the new project you're involved in, the International Military Council on Climate and Security.
Okay, well, last week in The Hague, we announced a new International Military Council on Climate and Security, which will bring together military leaders from around the world to address climate change as a threat multiplier. To bring together, we now recognize that militaries around the world are increasingly at the front lines of climate change. And so marshaling their commitment, their analysis, their ability to communicate within their countries, within their regions, we think will enable us to form a force commensurate with the global climate challenge.
And what's the level of participation?
So in announcing it last week, my co-partner in this effort is the former Dutch Chief of Defense, General Tom Middendorp. We already have commitments from the French. We have interest from a number of other countries as well who are looking forward to participating with us. We're supported by a range of think tanks across the U.S. and Europe and ultimately others that are committed to launching this effort.
Well, Sherri, your leadership on this is inspiring. Let me ask you, what are you looking forward to as far as the next marker in this challenge? Is there anything coming up that will be critical in assessing where we are and what actions can next be taken?
Well, we'll see later in the UN, later this year in the UN. The UN Security Council has made climate security an important component of their dialogue. The Swedes and the Italians and a number of other countries have put this high on their agenda. So we've begun in that forum using a new doctrine called the responsibility to prepare to advance these concepts of climate security. Responsibility to prepare means in this, we face an unprecedented risk in climate change, an existential risk to our civilization. At the same time, we have unprecedented foresight in this era through a combination of technology, predictive capability, marshaling human and other forces to be able to institutionalize the elements we need to address climate security and be able better to prepare for the future and make our societies more resilient. So the Germans will join the Security Council later this year. They intend to make that a very important part of their leadership there. So I think we're going to see more in international fora. You also see it happening in other international institutions. And then whether it's in ASEAN or in the G20. And then at the same time, we're going to see, more, I think, pressure in the United States to grow domestic leadership in this area, and it's going to be a very interesting and exciting year. There's going to be some tumult around it, but at the same time, I think we've got a whole generation represented by our young people that are demanding action, and that's, as we know from history, that's often been the tidal wave that has forced constructive change in our society.
Well, Sherri, thank you very much. And it really is good to hear some optimism on this issue. It can feel overwhelming at times. And glad to know you've been on the job longer than Margaret Thatcher and clearly longer than her on the both sides of the equation. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on your new post, too.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again for another. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.